6 months after his wife walked out with the prenup she had written herself, Marshall Oae sat on the same bench in Marcus Garvey Park every afternoon. He had lost everything. His company was gone, his fortune was gone, his marriage was over, even his son had stopped calling. Most people who passed him saw nothing more than another quiet man sitting alone in a park. They had no idea that he had once built a company worth billions of dollars and spent more than 2 decades creating affordable housing for thousands of families. But one afternoon, a woman pushing a food cart stopped when she saw him. She recognized him immediately. Marshall didn't recognize her. The woman watched him for a moment, then went back to her cart. The next day she returned with a plate of food. The day after that she came back again. Marshall had no idea that the woman feeding him was someone he had helped 10 years earlier on a sidewalk in New Orleans, and he had no idea that her kindness was about to save his life. Marshall Oae grew up in Harlem on Holly Street. His father, Eugene Oae, was a plumber who woke up before sunrise every morning and spent his life fixing things with his hands. Eugene taught Marshall a lesson he never forgot: a man's name matters because it follows him everywhere. Marshall carried that lesson into adulthood. He worked hard, earned scholarships, studied finance, and eventually founded Oae Capital Partners. Unlike many developers, Marshall focused on affordable housing. Over the next 22 years, he built thousands of housing units across multiple states and became one of the most respected names in the industry. His company eventually managed hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Success followed, so did wealth. Marshall married Simone Reeves, a successful attorney. Together they built a life that looked perfect from the outside. They raised a son named Dorian and moved in circles filled with investors, executives, politicians, and professionals. By every traditional measure, Marshall had won. But the event that would later change everything happened far away from boardrooms and investment meetings. 10 years earlier, Marshall traveled to New Orleans. One afternoon he stopped at a small food stand run by a woman named Nain Tobito. Nain was raising her young daughter, Jolene, while trying to keep her struggling food business alive. The food was extraordinary. Marshall sat quietly and watched people eat. He watched the woman work. He watched her daughter help around the stand. And he realized that the food she was serving was worth far more than the few dollars she was charging for it. Before leaving, Marshall placed $200 on the table. Nain tried to give him change. He refused. Then he walked away without giving his name. 3 days later, Nain received a call from a lawyer. A man named Marshall Oae had paid 6 months of rent on a market stall for her. He had also purchased commercial kitchen equipment, a fryer, a prep station, and everything she needed to expand her business. The total investment was $14,000. There were no repayment terms, no contract, no conditions, only a handwritten note. The food was worth more than what I paid. This is the rest. Nain folded the note and placed it inside a recipe her grandmother had written on the back of a church bulletin. For the next 10 years, she carried both. She never saw Marshall again. She never learned much about him. But she never forgot what it felt like when someone believed in her before she had anything to show for it. That memory became the foundation for everything she built afterward. For years, Oae Capital continued to grow. Marshall trusted his chief financial officer, Vernon Ashford, completely. Vernon was intelligent, experienced, and seemed devoted to the company's mission. What Marshall didn't know was that Vernon had spent years building a second system beneath the legitimate one. Money that investors believed was funding affordable housing projects was quietly being redirected through shell companies and fake developments. The fraud remained hidden because it was designed to look like ordinary business risk. Then the market shifted, the loans came due, projects began collapsing. By the time Marshall realized something was wrong, it was too late. Personal guarantee clauses buried inside loan documents had connected his own assets to debts he never knowingly approved. The company unraveled quickly. Creditors moved in, accounts were frozen, properties were seized. The business Marshall had spent 22 years building disappeared. 11 days later, Simone filed for divorce. The prenup she had written protected her assets completely. Marshall watched his marriage end almost as quickly as his company. Then came Dorian, his son. Looked at the situation and chose the parent who still appeared secure. The phone calls stopped. The messages stopped. The silence became complete. Marshall left the home he had built and moved into a small rooming house in Harlem. Every afternoon he sat on the same bench in Marcus Garvey Park. day after day, week after week, until one afternoon a food cart appeared nearby. The woman operating it stared at him longer than most people did. The next day she brought him a plate of chicken. Marshall accepted it politely. The following day she returned, then the day after that, 7 days she arrived with food and asked for nothing. Eventually Marshall began talking. He told her everything: the collapse, the fraud, the divorce, the betrayal, the son who no longer called. Nain listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked a single question: "Do you still have the records?" Marshall did. He had saved every report, every filing, every financial document. Nain nodded. Then she told him she knew someone. A few days later, Nain brought Marshall to the office of Clarence Abrams. Clarence was a forensic accountant and attorney who specialized in financial fraud. Marshall opened the hard drive and showed him the records. Clarence spent nearly half an hour studying the files. When he finally looked up, his conclusion was immediate: this isn't bankruptcy, it's theft. The documents showed evidence of deliberate fraud, shell companies, hidden transactions, manipulated reports, personal guarantees inserted without approval, a paper trail stretching back years. Clarence took the case and immediately contacted federal regulators. The SEC opened an investigation. What they discovered was staggering. Vernon had moved millions of dollars through a network of shell companies while convincing investors and business partners that the projects were legitimate. The fraud affected multiple victims and totaled nearly $180 million. Then investigators uncovered another connection. A trust managed by Vernon contained assets belonging to Simone. The trust itself wasn't proof of criminal wrongdoing, but it established a relationship between them that raised serious questions. The investigation became public. Simone's professional life began falling apart. Her social circle disappeared. The law firm she had worked at for years cut ties with her. Her legal license was suspended pending investigation. Meanwhile, Dorian discovered the truth through a newspaper article. For the first time in months, he called his father. Marshall answered. The conversation was brief. Dorian admitted he hadn't known what had really happened. Marshall simply told him he understood. Soon afterward, Vernon Ashford was arrested. The man who had stolen everything was finally facing consequences. But while the investigation was unfolding, something else was happening. Marshall was changing. He began helping Nain at the food cart. At first he carried supplies. Then he learned how to cook. He burned the first batches of chicken, made mistakes, started over. Gradually he learned. For the first time in decades, every dollar earned was connected directly to physical effort. No investors, no board meetings, no leverage, just work. Marshall also grew close to Jolene. One afternoon she asked for help with a personal finance assignment. Marshall sat beside her and patiently explained budgeting, income, expenses, and savings. As he taught her, he realized something painful. He had spent years funding Dorian's education, yet he had never taken the time to teach his own son these same lessons. Helping Jolene forced him to confront everything he had missed while chasing success. And for the first time since losing everything, he felt useful again. Months later, the fraud case reached its conclusion. Vernon Ashford was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and money laundering. Federal authorities seized his assets. Victims received restitution based on documented losses. Marshall's share came to $23 million. Years earlier, that amount would have seemed insignificant compared to the fortune he once controlled. Now it felt different. Now it felt like enough. Instead of rebuilding OAE Capital, Marshall decided to build something new. He purchased an abandoned building in Harlem and transformed it into a community food center. The project would include vendor stalls, a shared commercial kitchen, business support services, and mentorship for food entrepreneurs trying to build better lives. When the plans were finished, Marshall showed them to Nain. Across the top of the page was the name, Tibito OA Community Kitchen. Nain looked at him. "You put my name first." Marshall smiled. Her food had helped him stand again. Her name belonged first. The project moved forward. Marshall also established a scholarship fund for the children of food vendors. Jolene became the first recipient. She earned admission to college on a pre-med track. Years of hard work were finally paying off. Then opening day arrived. The building was full. People crowded the vendor stalls. Families filled the tables. The place buzzed with energy. Late that morning, Dorian appeared. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't warned anyone. He simply walked inside. he found his father standing beside a friar wearing an apron. Marshall looked up, their eyes met, neither man said much. Dorian picked up an apron and stepped beside him. For the rest of the day they worked together, serving food, cleaning counters, helping customers, not talking much, not needing to. When the day ended, they stood outside beneath the illuminated sign, Tibaido OA Community Kitchen. "I like the name," Dorian said. Marshall looked at the sign. "She earned it, that was all." The woman who ultimately saved Marshall wasn't someone who stayed because of his wealth. She wasn't someone impressed by his success. She was a woman who remembered a kindness shown to her 10 years earlier, when she found him with nothing left. She didn't calculate what he was worth, she calculated what he needed: a meal, a conversation, a reason to keep going. Marshall lost billions, he lost his company, he lost his marriage, he nearly lost his son, but in the end, the thing that saved him wasn't money, it wasn't status, it wasn't power, it was loyalty, the kind that asks for nothing in return, the kind that remains after everyone else leaves. The kind you only notice when the room becomes empty and one person is still standing in the doorway. If someone showed up for you after 10 years simply because they remembered what you did when they had nothing, would you trust it, or would you wonder what they wanted? Leave your answer below. If this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when nobody else did, send it to them, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.